Little wet and dreary day here, but it's exciting inside, and I can hardly wait to get started. Because of the size of the audience and because I'm not interacting with you directly, I'm not sure what everybody's level of understanding is, so I want you to think of this as an introduction. If you're a professional in the world of land management and in dealing with invasive species, some of this is review for you. If you've never thought about this at all, maybe I can open up some avenues of exploration as you continue to expand your knowledge about invasive species. So with that, anticipating success, what happens after you remove that invasive from your ecosystem landscape? Understanding and planning what comes next. So I want to start with the obvious. Invasive species are everywhere. I'm assuming that you signed in because you already know that. You woke up with the Burmese python in your bedroom. You looked out the window at a what I call a biological diversity of some non-indigenous grass completely wiping out the understory of your forest wood. You went out the front door and found 80-pound fish knocking you out of your rowboat. Then you went around to the side garden and found that whatever vine your neighbor had planted or had blown in had completely covered your urban agricultural site. And yes, when you went to the ornamental garden, there were big signs saying, how could you plant that dangerous, beautiful species? So invasive species are everywhere. They're so ubiquitous that many people don't notice them as they drive by the landscape at 60 miles an hour. We suffer from landscape illiteracy, and invasive species become part of the assumption of that's what the environment has to hold. However, the valiant few, the brave band of brothers and sisters who rush into the breach, know that invasive species are a major problem. They're altering the landscape, altering the ecosystem. They are a major, major threat to native and endangered species. In fact, invasives are everywhere, allwhere, and the brave band of professionals struggle to get rid of them. In fact, many people, many organizations band together. They get the paid professionals and staff, volunteer staff, and they arrange armies to go out and remove the invasive species. You know who you are in this picture. The plan is all about attacking the dominant invader of the region. Invasive species, like politics, are all local, so every region has its own textbook poster child invasive. We put a plan together, we go out, we remove the invasive species, however long that takes. We are challenged every day by pulling, spraying, weeding, whacking, whatever it takes to remove it. And finally, some of us achieve victory, and then we go and have a pizza party and maybe a beer, and we go home. That's where this talk starts. I'm assuming that you have reached the point where you can have success. And we need to talk about what comes next. Now, this slide is truly review, I hope, for everybody. Invasive species have many definitions, and almost every locality has its own twist on the definition. From a U.S. federal perspective, this is the definition. We all have to sort of agree on what the problem is before we can have solutions, and this is not a talk on definitions. I may do that some other time, but I'm using this definition when I talk about invasive species. So for the purposes of this talk, we're talking about alien. Guess I have to tell you what that is. Non-native, foreign, non-indigenous, exotic species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Again, there are other definitions. This is the one I'm using. In fact, as you're putting your plan together, knowing what your definition is and writing it down and having all the stakeholders and people who are going to be involved, not only in the eradication of the original species, but in planning for what comes next, everybody agreeing on what an invasive species is, do not take that for granted. It is absolutely necessary that all stakeholders, whether they are active or just interested, agree on what an invasive species is. Do not take that for granted. So how do invasive species get here? Well, the recipe for establishment of the original invasive species here in Maryland, maybe it's kudzu or more likely English ivy or mile-a-minute weed, there are multiple pathways. Professionals know what these pathways are. If you're new to this, you need to have a clear idea of how the next set of invaders are going to get in. If you've cleared an urban park or a natural area of the primary invader, and you have a road cutting through, such as the one over on the left, you have a pathway for secondary invasion. So be very clear. Make sure that you understand your pathways. They are the recipe for establishment, and in the case of this talk, reestablishment. By now you must understand, or you must begin to understand, that removal of an invasive species is the start, not the end of the program. Let me say that again. Successfully removing an invasive species or managing or controlling it such that it is reduced to background noise is the beginning of your project, not the end. The beginning, not the end. So you identify a problem species. You are lucky enough to have an island, and you are the land manager for the island, which means you can sort of maybe kind of control some of the variables that your continental colleagues can't. And you say, hey, we've got this sort of feral cat, and it's causing problems. We need to get rid of feral cat. And you successfully get rid of the feral cat, which then allows another non-native to explode, the island rat, which then really goes after one of the things you were trying to protect in the first place, the native endangered species. This is classic tale. And while it's very clear in this example of what's going on, the cat would go after the bird, and that was bad, but the rat was even better at destroying the nests and getting at the eggs of the bird, really causing a decline. You need to think through the relationships of your ecosystem. It's not good enough to just identify a major invasive and have a plan for its eradication and go home. Almost certainly, you are going to have unintended consequences. To give you another example here, you can see the picture here, adverse effect of eradication. We have a campsite, again on an island, because these are easy to document. We eradicate feral goats, an animal. And picture on the top, you can see the little, the structure is pretty hidden. However, eradicating the goat allows an exotic vine that was being kept in check by the exotic goat to swamp the island. You trade one problem for an even bigger problem. Again, here in the mid-Atlantic, we have evidence that if you go in and remove the mile a minute that is simply destroying your park, your ecosystem, or natural area in the mid-Atlantic area, and you are successful and you don't have a plan, you get all kinds of things, none of which you wanted, after you remove the miserable thorny vine. So you need a plan, and you have to think like a gardener. Now, since the ancient Greeks and Aristotle's student Theophrastus, every gardener knows, / farmer, that the first thing you do is you get up and you look for plants and animals that don't belong in your garden or farm. If it's a plant, we call this weeding. It is the most important thing you do, is to remove the things that you have identified that you don't want. Every farmer in the West, and also in Asia for at least recorded history, gets up in the morning with a plan to go out and do early detection and rapid response. In fact, in agriculture and horticulture, it's called IPM. Early detection and rapid response is not a new idea. It's a 2,000-year-old idea. You need to know what belongs and what doesn't. You have to have a plan so that you can restore or maintain the original system. What we do normally in our invasive species plan is to the left of the box here called removal. We have a plan that has identified a species or a suite of species. We have a plan to remove them, but we don't have the next two boxes because we think we're finished, and part of that is because we think the system is a natural system, and if we only get rid of the original invaders, everything will be fine. We will take Rousseau's idea and step out of the system, and then it'll take care of itself. For many reasons, that doesn't work. So you need some kind of regime, some kind of protocol, some questions to ask, and the first one is, what are you doing? If the answer is removing species A and going home, then your plan has a problem. So the answer to this question has to be more than just removing the egregious original species, but how are you going to keep reestablishment of other species that are not quite a problem yet? And what are you going to do to allow indigenous species to reestablish and get control and build resiliency? So what are you doing can't just be we're going out and pulling X or swatting Y. You need to be in compliance with government rules. I'm not going to go through those. Those of you in the government know which rules those are, and those of you that aren't should know, and they're all online. And I'm talking about permitting, pesticides, certification, guidelines. You really need to have a good idea of what subject matter experts have said are best management practices and what local, state, and federal government authorities are working hard to ensure. You should be asking yourself, if you've identified a removal strategy and an early detection strategy, is there a better way? Just because you've made an initial assumption of a set of, we're going to go in with a combination of chemicals and hand pulling, is there a better way of doing it? You need to be asking that all the time. You need to differentiate between regulated and non-regulated areas. If you think about riparian and waterways, they tend to be heavier. They have an extra layer of regulation on them, and you need to know about that as you're designing your plan. You certainly want to do it at less cost, and cost doesn't have to be money. Cost can be time and resources. And is there something more you should do? If you are managing a land or a garden or a farm, if you are managing the environment, these are the questions you wake up to, whether it's invasive species or anything else, and you go to sleep with. So what I'm saying is you need a comprehensive invasive species management plan. And the management plan can't be, we're going to remove the kudzu. That's part of the plan. That's not a management plan. That's a particular effort, a subset of a management plan. You have to be comprehensive. Whether you're gardening or managing a natural area, a comprehensive outlook and strategy is what's necessary. And it needs to include prevention, which is the easiest, most cost-effective thing and the hardest thing to sell to the people who are funding your effort, because in fact, you have to go and prove a negative. I need X dollars to prevent Y, and then the funder says, well, Y isn't there. Why should I give you X? So this is the best way of doing things and the most difficult when it comes to dealing with funding. You need an early detection and rapid response plan and system in place for after you remove whatever it is you've identified. Of course, you need one when you come in to identify what the problem is and how you're going to deal with its spread. The point I'm trying to make here is usually we think of this as we're going to put an EDRR plan together. We're going to install it because we have this natural pristine area, and it's going to help us with prevention. But most of us don't inherit or take over a pristine area. We've got an area that's already fuzzed over. So we know what we have to remove, and once we've removed it, we really need an EDRR, or as they say in agriculture, an IPM strategy to deal with what comes next. You need control and management options, and you need a rehabilitation and restoration plan. So one of the issues is if you go in, say, with a biocontrol and it's wildly successful, then what? Because the biocontrol in a highly disturbed natural ecosystem, the ecosystem may have been altered into what some people call a novel ecosystem. And if you don't have a rehabilitation and restoration, we call this a landscape design plan, a list of the species you really want and the arrangements you really want, you're likely to get a big surprise. Assessments are key. All of this is easily found online, so I don't know that I'm going to dwell on things, but pathways, EDRR, control and management, rehab and restoration have subsectors over on the right. So your plan really needs to look at platforms and vectors. How are the invasive species getting in? How do bad, a value judgment, and good, value judgment species arrive? How do they establish? How do they spread? You need to be able to identify what's going on. Landscape literacy is extremely important. By identification here, I'm really speaking of the trophic interactions and the interactions in general, the ecological interactions. You need to conduct an environmental risk assessment of whatever it is you're proposing to do. Are you going to have unintended harmful consequences to other species or users of the system in your attempt to do good? Going to get rid of those goats and really cause a problem? Got to answer that question. In control of management, systematics or taxonomy, you really do need to understand the species and, you know, does it have 180 synonyms and what are its common names and is or is it not regulated in certain conditions and what is the market for it? But more importantly, how do you identify it in its different stages? Where is it most susceptible to control? Basic taxonomy is extremely important when developing your plan for all of the species, both the ones you want to preserve and the ones you want to remove. And of course, a site assessment, a landscape plan, a list of who belongs and who doesn't. So we're talking about invasive species, and broadly speaking, in a natural area, there are 4 large things to think about. As you remove the original species, you're looking at these 4 categories and what are the possible after effects that may allow a second suite of species that you don't want to come in. So, for instance, in an environmental assessment of what you're planning to do and what might happen afterwards is doing nothing. Don't forget that you need to always assess doing nothing. You probably assessed what doing nothing does for the original species, but is the original species, invasive species, suppressing secondary species that may be even worse? You following me there? Probably should have had a slide for that. You want to look at mechanical, cultural, the abiotic solutions to your original problem. You know, if you go in with the DH Caterpillar tractor and remove the kudzu and the multiflora rose, you can be pretty successful removing that huge taproot and getting those that field of multiflora out. But the overwhelming chronic disturbance probably has opened up a whole suite of rehabilitation problems that might overwhelm the mere mortals among us. Mechanical and cultural control is always preferable, but you need to think about the scale and what are the unintended consequences of going that route. Now, chemicals, I think pretty much all of us have learned in the last 50 years that chemicals have their own challenge. Some of you listening may be, you know, I'll never do that. Well, you should, at least if you're deciding by policy not to use chemicals, you need to be thinking about what happens when you don't. I'm not saying that that should override the policy. What I'm saying is if your policy is non-chemical, then you need to think about the implications after a non-chemical control program. And that goes with biologics. If you're going to use biologics, what happens with success? So remember, I know this sounds like what you think about when you're removing the original species, but what I'm saying is it's even more important to do all of this after you're successful with the original control. Continuing on environmental assessments, again, I need to keep stressing that because this is the point of the program. These are things that most of you who are actively involved are doing in the front end, but I'm saying you need to do it in the back end. You have to do this, you have to have this plan in place, assuming success with your initial project. So this is what I like to call boilerplate, easily found online, description of the actual project, breakdown of the project into its key components. There's nothing earth-shattering or novel here. For those of you that do this all the time, you're simply doing this twice. You're doing these things in front of the removal of the kudzu, the multiflora rose, the English ivy, and then you're doing it again on now you have bare ground. What's going to happen? I am sort of talking in terms of plants, but this would impact animals, insects. Not sure how many of you are out there as volunteers removing diseases, so I'll let that pass. You need to list all factors, all aspects of your project that may impact other flora, other fauna, the entire ecosystem after you are successful. Trying to identify openings for the second invasion that almost certainly is going to come. Now, and then the most important thing. Every time you have established, I'm removing the first species, I'm using this method, it does this, you still need to list the alternatives and tell yourself and any reader why the alternatives are not as good at preventing the second infestation and slowing down rehabilitation and restoration. You have to examine alternatives in light of the ultimate goal, which is not the removal, but the restoration or the rehabilitation of the system or landscape or garden or farm. There are a number of ways of organizing your thoughts. Perhaps if enough of you are interested, we'll do a webinar specifically on some of these tools. Many of you may already know about the Leopold matrix. That's not the Leopold you're thinking about. Let me just show you what we're talking about here. The Leopold matrix measures, gosh, I'm going to lose all of you if I say anything about vectors. Don't worry about that. You sort of give two numbers to things. The magnitude of the problem, the scale of the problem, and you write these things down. This is partially subjective, partially objective. You can see the little chart. It's just helping you frame all of these ecological indicators that we just talked about. And more importantly, you're framing them in terms of a little box here. And eventually you will see patterns as you give every item a valuation. Now, I tend to like to do this in terms of ecosystem services, which are over on the left. I mean, ecosystem services, and then no action, abiotic, chemical, biologic. So I'm looking at the effect of each of my actions on ecosystem services. I divide the ecosystem service into regulating, providing, provisioning, informing. You will find different titles for these categories, and I've given you a sample. When I do this, I use 26 categories. 26 even I couldn't see on the PowerPoint, so I reduce them to something manageable so you get the idea. If you want to know more about this, if you type in Leopold matrix on Google, as I did before I did this show, you will see tons of descriptions on how to go about doing this. What you're trying to do is organize all of the observations I just talked about. Because in the end, what you're really doing when you remove an invasive species, if it's a plant, you're weeding. You have a giant garden. If your garden is the Denali Range in Alaska, it just happens to be larger than most of the eastern United States, but it's still a garden. You are still saying, this is a weed and this belongs here. You are still making an original decision matrix that says, these are the plants I want and these are the ones I don't. And you're doing this because these incursions, these pressures on the ecosystem are so great that the system itself can no longer push back, offset. It needs a little help. So like a gardener, you're giving it a little help by removing some of the obviously identified heavy-duty aggressors, so the system can reset, so it can find its middle ground, its norm. The Leopold matrix you may have glazed over and said, he's got to be kidding. I'm not going to do all of that. Well, there are other methods. They all come down to pretty much the same thing. You need to list the important factors of your landscape, your wilderness, the land you're managing, your ecosystem. You need to come up with environmental indicators. You need to weigh these. Now, some of this is highly subjective based on professional experience or a great deal of education and probably a combination of both. In other words, if you're new to managing a landscape, some of this is not, what do I want to say, not self-evident. Just as the home ornamental gardener spends the first few years frustrated because it looks easy, but it doesn't work, so the land manager has to have a system that allows him to identify all of the interactions and relationships that may be affected when he removes an invasive species, whether it's a plant or an insect. Remember, if somehow you could get rid of an invasive insect, you are going to have unintended consequences. If the insect is destructive enough, such as the emerald ash borer, and somehow you can get control of it, something else is going to come in. The pressures, especially here in urban areas, are so great that just preventing the introduction isn't enough. It's, okay, I've done that, but what should I be looking at because I've kept the emerald ash borer out or I've controlled it somehow? And folks, if you know how to control it cost effectively, could you please send me an email? I really want to know what your solution is. Again, if you have a water edge here in the Chesapeake, we've got Phragmites. If you go up further into the mid-Atlantic, we've got Lythrum problems. Removing them is wonderful, but you can't stop there. You have to look at all of these indicators and make some judgments based on experience and professional expertise as to the effect of what you're doing, and then look at the effect to see if the clearing will allow, what is the rational, logical invasive species that might come in. I'm going to use another example here. If we remove some of the vines in the mid-Atlantic, Akebia, mile a minute, and we allow a little bit of sunshine into the woods, then we're likely to have a suite of invaders, including our favorite Japanese stiltgrass, Microstegium, move right in. This is not a surprise. Anybody who's managing the landscape and says, I'm going to remove mile-a-minute weed, ought to be thinking, and I have a plan to stop the Microstegium that's almost certainly coming next. If you're in Maryland, followed right behind with wavy leaf basket grass, Oplomenus. So you need plans for things that haven't happened yet. So we're really talking about an environmental assessment after success. That's what we're doing. I can't stress how important this is to have a complete, comprehensive plan. Removing the mile a minute may be done with a biologic control, but what's your plan to suppress control the microsthesia and or the chebia? Or if it gets a little warmer, the kudzu. Got a plan for that? And of course your plan is is a subset or involves the use of early detection and rapid response. You are looking at pathways, which we talked about, vectors, particular species for your ecosystem and the likelihood, plants that like disturbance, insects and diseases that can take advantage of an early disturbed site. But there's more. You can't have a plan in most areas that doesn't include stakeholders. And the stakeholders are more than the managers. They are the funders, the taxpayers if it's public land, the neighbors, whether it's public or not, and the neighbors, and then the users, whether they are infrequent drive-throughs or recreational sports hunter aesthetic users. They have to be in the table too. Why is that important? Because you may identify major invasives that have to be removed, and then you note that once you do that, you would be able to get to, say, some of the Norway maples and tree of heaven because you have removed the invasives, the vines and things from the woodland, and you run right into the save all trees at all cost stakeholders because you didn't involve them in your plan. I'm not making this up. Let me try that again. You have a suburban park. It is surrounded by a hedgerow of non-native thorn bushes and, just a mess of things. And you recognize that they are surrounding a woodland that is beginning to be invaded by invasive trees. So your plan says we will remove the understory invasives and we'll clean that up, and then that'll allow us to get in there and remove the invasive trees, and the next thing you know, you have neighbors chaining themselves. You can't cut my maple down, how dare you? So don't forget in your plan to include both active stakeholders and inactive stakeholders. They're all extremely important, and they need to be included before you start doing anything. So you need their input in the change of the pathways. You need their input into your plan for restoration and succession. What can they expect? Are you going to cut the trees down and it's going to be sunny, but the native trees will make it a shade forest again, and you need to convince people to wait a few years? And you need them to be involved in the suite of species that are acceptable. This slide sort of demonstrates that there are three groups, professional groups and general public people that need to be in, and how they interact. And I've sort of talked about this a little bit in the last slide. But you need restoration ecologists and invasion ecologists, or those restoration biologists and invasion biologists. Whatever, you need people who are experts, subject matter experts in both. And then you need the frontline practitioners, paid and volunteer, plus those full-time and part-time interested and disinterested stakeholders, and you need a conversation. If you are the land manager of a substantial natural area park, it could be in a little city, it can be out in the Rocky Mountains, and you think that you're going to do this autocratically by top-down dictation, not only can I guarantee that you will not be able to see everything, but you will have unintended consequences out of stakeholders that you didn't invite to the conversation, and that you will spend a lot of time having unnecessary arguments and debates with people after you successfully remove the first species. You must develop a team. Interdisciplinary teams of subject matter experts laced with interested, disinterested, uninterested, and groupie kind of neighboring, they didn't know they were interested, I don't even have a word for them, all have to be brought at the table, and you're following what I think this chart does very nicely, a kind of logical plan of communication and feedback. Again, in case you're lost and I'm talking a little fast, this is after you've identified and removed the species, the first species of concern. That's just the start. If you remove Phragmites, if you remove multiflora rose, if somehow you get the tree of heavens and Norway maples under control, you have just started. That's just the beginning. No matter how much work and how many years it takes, that's the beginning. Because as every gardener knows, as soon as you get rid of weed A, weed B will be right there, and it's usually worse, especially if you didn't plan for it. Invasive species require this kind of plan. They require all of us to think like gardeners. I know that's horrible because in the last 30 years we've got this idea that if we just can step aside from natural areas, they'll take care of themselves. Here's the bad news, at least in the lower 48. A statistic I see occasionally says that 95% of the natural area has already been chronically disturbed. Read, mowed over, plowed over, developed over. That leaves 5%. And that 5% is fragmented, fractured, and distributed across the United States. So we don't have any ecosystems left that are not impacted by human activity, even if humans don't go into them. Let me be really clear. What's native at 600 parts per million CO2? This is why doing the plan for what comes next after success is so important. You can't just go out and remove one or two species and think the system is going to work. Now, I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover today. I want to review a little bit. Planning, it goes without saying, is the most important thing you can do. Invasive species are with us, and the introductions are growing faster, quicker, every day. Because of international trade, because of the speed of communication, the reasons most of you already know, because you can go to your cell phone and buy anything from any place, anywhere in the world, and have it delivered to you, the hitchhikers are coming. Meanwhile, our rare and endangered species are even more rare and endangered. Our last best places are getting smaller. And we need to think like stewards and gardeners. The gardener starts by removing the weed and then figures out what goes in, what takes the place of the plant, the unwanted plant that I just removed. What am I going to do about the groundhog trail or the deer trail through the garden? And if I do it, what is the negative impact going to be from my actions? Planning, conversation, interdisciplinary approach, multi-stakeholder input, and constant feedback are what you need when you're anticipating success. Your plan starts after you have successfully removed the first species. And with that, I think we'll take questions.
Well, John Peter, I think most people are going to either email you or ask in the question pane, and then I can forward you those questions.
That'd be fine.
Okay. Do you have another slide there with your contact info?
Oh, I don't know. I think so.
Well,
Let
I'll
me
put it up
see.
there if you do.
Oh, it's the old... so I can be reached